Connected Capital, a video series in which we look to shine a spotlight on an area of sustainability. In each episode, I'm joined by an expert from the fields of science, academia, policy, industry, philanthropy, or finance, in order to understand the connections between and within the natural capital and human capital worlds, and to explore how better deployment of financial capital can help preserve, protect, and nurture our planet for those to come. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Imogen Carmichael-Jack, Senior Consultant at Impactt. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Fumi.
So, Imogen, the vision behind this video series is to draw out the importance of connecting often really different worlds and spheres, and those spheres and worlds coming together to create long-term and lasting change. Within your own career, you've worked in such a different range of industries. You started by working in stewardship for the world's second largest asset manager, Vanguard, managing over $7 trillion of assets. You then worked directly in the fashion industry, launching Dame Vivienne Westwood's foundation. And you now work deeply within the fashion supply chain, conducting investigations in, as it were, sort of engine room. Can you talk about how you found working in such different industries and those contrasting industries with the same goal of sustainability and long-term change being at the heart? And has the transition between those different industries been challenging?
I think, to be honest, like you said, the consistent thread throughout is this focus on sustainability, and I think having that as my own personal mission throughout has made that transformation between different industries a little bit easier, because I think that in each step of my career, I've kind of learned something new from a different perspective about the same topics. So it's kind of like building on that from different perspectives each time. So like, I think in finance, for example, I got a lot of that like strategic level board oversight view because we were engaging with CEOs and board members about sustainability topics. So I got that very high level approach. Then working directly like in fashion, I think I saw the challenges that you can have in a brand to get buy-in from that top level. Sometimes I think there's conflicting opinions about where the business's capital is best spent and what return that would be and actually what the top risks are. So that was really interesting, seeing that sort of in-house mentality. And then I think now in working directly at Impactt as a consultant, I think a lot of our work is very, very worker-centric, so we actually have that access to workers on the ground in factories or in all sorts of different industries actually, but I'm mostly in the fashion industry, and actually understanding the worker's perspective. So now I think I've got all of those three levels, which has made it really interesting, and I think that makes it much less challenging to change industries because you've always got that common thread throughout. But yeah, it's been great.
And if you talk about sustainability, you mentioned human rights. Has there always been a focus on human rights in your work, or have you looked at environmental issues?
Yeah, so I think at the beginning I was much more broad-based on sort of environmental, social and governance, so all of the ESG spectrum. And I think then I went into the fashion sort of directly with Vivienne Westwood, and that was focused on environmental and human rights. And then I found Impactt after that, and we only focus on human rights. So actually we're not really doing much on environment at all, apart from when you think about it from a just transition perspective, so the impact of environmental change on workers. But I think the two are intrinsically so interlinked that actually even if you are a human rights consultancy, by default, you're looking at environmental issues as like in terms of, I don't know, increasing heat for workers in factories or things like the dumping of effluent treatment plant water in a local village, which might then like
impact their health, their families.
Exactly. And the water supply is then contaminated and things like that. So intrinsically it's linked in human rights anyway, but yeah, the specific focus on climate has like lessened through my career. But.
I think it's such an important thing for people to understand. I so often get asked by clients to build a climate change portfolio, and they expect that portfolio to be invested in, let's say, wind turbine manufacturers or semiconductors, companies really directly involved in the transition. What's really important for the clients to understand is that interlinkage. And that was one of the inspirations, to be honest, behind this video series, to help people understand that there are nothing should be seen in isolation or in a silo. So it's very interesting to hear you experience that from working with the companies to try and improve the human rights. Talking about the work of Impactt, can you just describe Impactt as a business and it's been around for 25 years, the work that as a company you do?
Yeah, so actually our founder, Rosie Hurst, I think it was part of her master's thesis, and it actually then became a company. So she really has been on the ground working she was in Bangladesh, I think, working on labour rights within the fashion industry, and then that became Impactt. So really that we've been on the ground with workers for more than 25 years, like you said. And we work with a range of different businesses, so it's not just fashion. So I'm sort of predominantly focused on fashion businesses, so garments and manufacturing. But we also work with a range of different industries, so anything from energy and heavy industries. We work with food and agriculture and things like that. So it's actually a broad spectrum, but I'm sort of more specialised on the fashion side of things. And yeah, we do a range of different things with our clients. So we work on like the diagnostic side of things. So that is, like you said, like the investigation. So we might do an investigation into sexual harassment or allegations of gender-based violence in a factory that have come up. We might look at, say, for example, a brand might come to us and say, we're interested in working with this new supplier. Can you do an assessment to find out whether there's any issues there or what's going on the ground? And then we might also do something like a forced labour assessment. So we would assess, that's usually when you know there might be an issue in a factory. So you look a lot more deeply into the ILO's 11 forced labour indicators, and then you really dig in to try and understand if there are instances of forced labour in the factory. But within all of the diagnostic work like that, we really focus on like interviewing workers, and actually that really worker-centric approach. So all of our assessments, particularly forced labour assessments, will try and speak to at least 10% of the workforce. Obviously it depends on the size of the workforce. If you're going into a factory with 6,000, 8,000 workers, it's not possible. But we try to speak to as many workers as possible, always in their native language, always with someone from that country, and always, we do a lot of intensive worker interview training, so it's done in a way that makes the workers feel most at ease and most comfortable to talk to us. So that's sort of the diagnostic side of things, but we also do it at the enterprise level. So we might do like a human rights risk assessment for a business, so looking into their supply chain to figure out where's their biggest risks and things like that. And then the really interesting part of the work is doing the solution stuff. So that's actually going in and trying to fix the problems that we uncover. So quite often we'll work with clients, and we'll find a whole host of issues in a supplier or a factory, and then they will work with us to actually put together like a corrective action plan or a remediation plan, which will then work directly with the site over the course of like a year, 6 months to a year, to try and fix those problems, and then really do an assessment at the end to measure whether that's actually been closed out. So those are my favourite types of work, where you actually really get to see the impact of what you're doing. And then we do some sort of this more broader change at scale stuff, which is looking at moving the dial in the industry across the industry. So this is more of the sort of big impact pieces that we do. So we've worked on the Impacct's principles of remediation for the repayment of recruitment fees. So that is repaying principles that we advise companies to follow when they're repaying workers for the fees that they might have paid in order to get a job. So I think there was a lot of brands who said that it was going to be too difficult for them to be able to pay back workers for the fees that they might have paid. And it's the easiest way to actually stop workers from being in bonded labour, is to actually pay them back for the money that they might have had to pay. So we've published the principles for repayment, which are now available sort of online, which we encourage companies to use in their own remediation work as well.
You mentioned the ILO at the beginning of your response there. Can you just talk about the use of internationally agreed frameworks and how important that is?
I mean, yeah, I think it's the cornerstone of everything we do, is looking at those international frameworks and that really outline best practice. I think for some suppliers it might be sort of like a high bar to set, but we will always recommend in line with best practice, international best practice. So we use sort of the ETI base code, which has sort of the different principles, as well as the ILO's forced labour indicators and things like that to guide suppliers and brands on like where they should be, really.
Yeah. And do you find regional challenges with those?
Yeah, I think it can be tough, and I think particularly I know the work that our team does in agriculture can be quite hard with child labour standards. I think we always are looking at international best practice, but there's a lot of rural communities where children will be helping out on farms with picking and with seasonal work. So it's really like you have to work on a really collaborative journey to actually try and implement that change, for sure.
Yeah. Something that I think people might be surprised to hear is how active the brands are in wanting to know this information. Is that something that you were surprised about when you started to work at Impactt?
I think so, yeah, and I think that you really notice actually the passionate people who work within brands, within like all sorts of brands. When you look at it from fashion, from luxury to fast fashion, and all across the board, actually, you have very passionate people working in amazing teams, in sort of sustainability teams or labour rights teams who are really trying to do important things. But I think the challenge comes sometimes from buy-in from the top. Yeah. So it depends on the business and sort of the strategy of the business and the overall perception of the risk that human rights might present to that business as to whether they have the leverage as a team to try and actually get that buy-in from the top and get enough funding within that sort of arm of the business to do the work.
We've spoken before about the fact that you strongly believe that there can be growth and garments that can be sold all over the world that are affordable, yet human rights standards be adhered to and be high quality. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the key thing here for me is that actually when you think about global supply chains and the dependency of a lot of these regions on fashion and actually on fast fashion, you do see that in order to move away from that, it's going to be a very, very long journey, and it's something that needs to happen over a very long period of time. You can't just suddenly turn around and say we're not going to be buying from Bangladesh anymore. If you look, for example, Bangladesh, I think it's 80% of their exports, don't quote me on the number, come from garments exports.
But neither should they. That would be a travesty.
Exactly.
For Bangladesh.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that there really needs to be this partnership between brands, between civil society, and between the sort of the workers on the ground in these countries who are sort of working in advocacy and working to sort of to get their voices heard about the key issues that can come together collaboratively to create a more sustainable industry. But it's not easy, for sure, and I think it's a long journey, and I think the key thing is actually hearing from the people who are on the ground in country, who can actually explain to you what the problems are. And yeah, I think that's the most important thing. And then obviously working then with the policymakers in those countries to try and ensure that workers are actually paid enough in terms of minimum wage and things like that, which isn't necessarily what we do at Impactt, but we work with some of these. I particularly work with a women's rights organisation in Bangladesh that are doing that work on behalf of the workers in the country. Yeah,
that brings me on to a point that I wanted to talk about, this idea around connecting different spheres, one of those spheres being policy and that sort of advocacy work. How much overlap is there, and how do you coordinate from here in the UK, or does it take you going to Bangladesh to have those really rich conversations?
Yeah, so this is a slightly different project that actually isn't with a brand. This is more of like an NGO funding thing. So we're managing a grant for a large foundation, the Lourdes Foundation, and we are funding a small organisation in Bangladesh called the Awash Foundation, and they are building this women's rights forum, or RMG Garments Workers Forum, predominantly for female workers, and they're advocating for change in country. So actually, it's very difficult and it's very challenging in the political context in Bangladesh. I think at the moment there's a lot of turmoil, and I don't know, it can be very challenging to get things moving in the political sphere in Bangladesh. So yeah, but the work that they're doing is on the ground all the time, and actually meeting with policymakers, meeting with the manufacturing associations, and just constantly trying to push for that change. But it's very, very hard. And yeah, moving policy when you think that there's also so many other issues and so many other challenges, so human rights can fall quite low down on the priority list in that context. But yeah, we're working constantly to try and move the dial. That's for sure.
So you do a lot of work on the ground. I know you travel a lot to different parts of the world. Can you just give a bit of an insight into the day-to-day of what it's like going to do an investigation in a factory for a brand?
Yeah. So typically what we would do is we would do a site tour. So we would look around. Actually, like, you then have to have kind of your inspector hat on, like noticing if you think anything looks a bit strange.
Just noting things down?
Noting things down, yeah.
Okay.
There's some like little hints and tips. So for example, if a factory, if you notice that all of their fire extinguishers are out of date, it's probably a sign that there's a lot more issues than what you think that there might be on the surface. We would then sort of have all of our worker interviewers there, so we would start worker interviews with all of the different nationalities. So often we might be speaking to 5 different nationalities in one factory over the course of 2 to 3 days typically. The lead investigator will then, so like myself or someone else in my team, we also have a network of associates who we work with, would then interview the management, so trying to really understand their policies and their processes and how that's put into place, whether they have any training. So for example, we might ask them about sexual harassment training, or also seeking to understand what mechanisms they have to actually get workers' feedback. So like we call them grievance mechanisms. So if there's an issue, how are the workers reporting it? So we kind of
safeguarded.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we kind of just like dig into every single aspect of the business and really what's going on to try and build this big picture around the current state of play. And yeah, that's a typical assessment. And then something for like an investigation where we know there's a specific issue like sexual harassment or, I don't know, specific cases of forced labour. It's a much more tailored approach, looking like only specifically at that issue. So we would tailor the questions around that specific topic.
Yeah. And then you compile a report. I guess that takes many weeks.
Yeah. It takes a couple of weeks after we come back. Usually we say, I think 15 business days to actually get that.
Oh wow, it's quite quick.
Finalised. Yeah. And some of them are pretty dense. But I love it, and it's really, really rewarding work, particularly when, like I said, the clients will then come back to work together with you to try and remediate those issues.
Yeah. And what's the response from the brands? Are they usually prepped to listen and hear the issues, or do they sometimes get defensive? How does that usually go?
It varies. I think it varies, but 9 times out of 10, there's a good reception, I would say. And I think that it's something that we always explain during, like, we have a kick-off meeting, and we'll be like, we don't know what we're going to find. I think you need to be prepared to hear whatever might be going on in the factory. Yeah. And uncovering those issues doesn't mean that it's the end of a business relationship with the supplier, right? We would always recommend that you work together with that supplier to actually fix those problems. And I think it's just... it's a credit to the brands to actually be, in the first place, actually trying to really uncover those issues and coming to Impactt, because they know that we are like experts within the field, right? Yeah. It's really our key focus is actually understanding what's going on for the workers. Yeah. So you can go to a sort of a third-party audit company who, it's very much just a checkbox, and it's actually not really that in-depth when you're looking at actually trying to uncover the issues. They don't speak to that many workers quite often. It's very like tick box, tick box, tick box. Whereas when you come to Impactt, you're getting usually a lot more of an in-depth and a bit more of a bespoke approach. Yeah. So you usually uncover more issues if you come to Impactt versus sort of a third-party audit. But it means that you're having more of an insight into the true risk, actually, because these things could end up coming out later on with a whistleblower or an NGO or something like that, where actually you end up in a lot more trouble than, say, you would have if you uncovered it earlier on. Yeah, or the investment industry find out, and then there's impact on the valuation of the business, let's say. And we're talking about big brands here. I'm not going to ask you to name any, but these are not small niche organisations that are doing everything around sustainability. These are very, very large multinational businesses that we're talking about. Multinational. So for me, working, for example, from like the luxury fashion space with big listed companies all the way down to sort of fast fashion listed companies, we also work with some smaller brands and some of the daughter companies of some of these big conglomerates. But yeah, I would say the vast majority of my company, the clients I work with, are listed companies. Yeah. So do you think the perception that most of the public have that these big brands don't care about these issues is wrong? And what do you think we could do to sort of change that? Yeah, I think it's wrong. I think also there's a big difference between the leaders and the laggards, and I don't think you can paint everyone with the same brush. But I know that I would be more concerned about the brands we're not talking to than the brands that we are talking to. But there are still some really good news stories, I think, that potentially people don't hear. Definitely, and you've got some brands that invest huge amounts of money into this to actually ensure that they are trying to do the right thing and really putting like incredibly talented people in these teams who are really pushing and driving for change. And we've seen that with a lot of big brands. So yeah, there's positive movement. There's definitely the momentum going in the right direction, I think.
Yeah.
Look, it's so encouraging to hear so many big brands engaging with this work.
And I know there's pressure from industries like the finance industry to get this information, but I think fundamentally this is it's driven, like you say, from the brands themselves, and then wanting to understand and stamp out any of these bad behaviours. So it's really, really great to hear, and so interesting to hear your personal insight. We've got a final question, or I've got a final question. We ask everyone this. The idea behind this video series, like I said, is to connect different worlds, whether that's different worlds in the space of sustainability or different industries in this case. And we like each guest to bring or recommend another guest to be brought into the conversation. Who would you recommend to be brought in next?
So I would say, from the work that I've been doing in Bangladesh, and particularly with this labour rights organisation, the Awash Foundation, the founder of that labour rights organisation, her name is Nazma Akhtar, and she was actually a child labourer herself, and then has kind of come up through the ranks of becoming a trade unionist, and now actually set up this foundation herself. And I think she has a really inspiring story in sort of advocating for workers' rights in Bangladesh. So yeah, she would be my pick.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Imogen. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Vivi.
Cheers.
Thanks.